I think one of the themes and maybe the raison d'etre of Boltz is, I think, as you had described in a blog post, as AlphaFold had its success and then moved to AlphaFold 2 and then 3 and so forth, it became more increasingly closed. DeepMind has a spin-off called Isomorphic Labs, which has its own industry partnerships and I think is trying to figure out a compelling business model to be able to monetize some of their technology. And with that comes, I think, as you had described, maybe closing off some of the new innovations and benefits that they've had. You, as an organization, seem to have taken more of a kind of an open source, community first perspective, and are trying to really democratize the innovations that you are creating through your own company. So actually, maybe just starting there as a starting point. Am I characterizing that correctly? And if so, could you share more about sort of your approach versus an AlphaFold?
Yeah, so I think what we think about as being critical is can the scientists that are pushing developing the next therapeutics able to access the models that we create. And as you were saying, the decision that DeepMind, Alphabet, Isomorphic went down is that basically in their analysis they probably believed that it wasn't really feasible to build a big enough business just selling these models and giving access to these models. And so what they decided to do is we basically need to create a fully integrated pharmaceutical company. And so Isomorphic is really trying to become kind of the next big fully integrated pharmaceutical company. And so the way that they are commercializing these models is not commercializing the models at all. They are using these models, basically hiring chemists and biologists to use these models internally to develop drugs that they're going to sell downstream, maybe after some clinical trials to pharma, or bring them to market directly. And so our approach is very different in the sense that on the other hand the idea is that we want to give access to these models to chemists and biologists, and because we have to make it sustainable and we have to build a business, we obviously are going to have to also charge for some of that access to these companies, but it's still something that allows them to get access. And so what we're trying to build is really kind of like a platform where we can really concentrate a lot of the research and the development of kind of next level generation of models, data generation, in a way that we can then give the benefits in a way that it's somewhat linked to usage. Because the challenge also with these models, as you get closer and closer, some companies that can maybe huge investment resources like Isomorphic, spending hundreds of millions a year on the development of these models, can afford developing the next generation models. But if you have a new startup from coming out of let's say MIT, how are you going to develop those models? You're going to spend 2 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to develop these models just because you want to bring a therapeutic to market. And so that's kind of who we also want to empower with our platform.
So these 100,000 users that we talked about at the top of your platform, what are they getting access to, and to what extent do they need to pay for that access?
So at this point, most of our users are users of our open source models. So over the past year and a half, we have released these open models. Our models are now adopted across every large pharmaceutical company, thousands of biotech companies, lots of academic labs. And so most of these teams are kind of taking these models, installing them on some GPUs that they have access to, and then running to power their application, whether that's developing therapeutics, that's developing some kind of consumer product, that's kind of doing basic biological research. With the platform, we are sort of like taking a couple of extra steps. One is that really kind of continuing pushing further on the reducing kind of the barrier and kind of that fixed cost. is that by aggregating a lot of the investment in putting together the a scalable infrastructure, we are able to allow folks that maybe don't have access to a lot of GPUs to run a big screen, because maybe you're gonna run a big screen today, and then for the next couple of months you're gonna test those molecules in the lab. You can't buy or get access to a lot of GPUs and then not use them anymore. It becomes unsustainable. And secondly, also when it comes to using kind of these models, it's definitely kind of not trivial. Both installing them, but also figuring out what is the right way of using it. And so we're also trying to lower the barrier of entry from that perspective, really building an environment that it's designed for chemists and biologists to use without necessarily first of all knowing how to code, but also knowing kind of the in and outs of these models.
I'm curious, going back to the Pfizer partnership, I'm imagining one of the things that Pfizer gets in this partnership with you is some help with cleaning, or at least having a sense of how to approach all of that data that you mentioned that they might have, but that may not be kind of in the right shape in order to really take advantage of a platform like yours. Will they, I guess, as they maybe marry their data with your platform, will there be like tangible improvements, do you think, to your models that happen with Pfizer? And if so, do those stay with Pfizer? Do those get shared at some point? What does that look like?
Yeah, so without obviously going into some of the specifics that I can share, but yes, the goal is definitely to build best-in-class models, leveraging kind of all that amazing data that Pfizer has generated over the years, and those improvements indeed at this point stay with Pfizer in the sense that will be a model exclusively kind of licensed to Pfizer. And so, in that sense, I think, we'll see if in the future there is, like you were mentioning before, some opportunities to maybe pull, some of these data together or do kind of some interesting things like that. But right now, we really want to enable, every user of our platform with whatever, resources they have, whatever, data they have to get the most out of, kind of for their particular application. And so, to get the most out of your application, you should definitely use all the data that you have. And so that's, where, the idea of, yes, using kind of these last generation models is important, but, using these last generation models without, putting the data that you have that is very specific and useful for your domains, sort of like becomes, kind of like you either have to choose, some model that is trained on, your data, or a model that is trained, that's kind of much larger and better quality, but it's trained on kind of the public data. So what do you choose? And we basically give an option to third option of sort of like marrying the best of those worlds by integrating kind of the data that these companies have into kind of the best models.
I feel like my reflection on this is just business models and biotech in general are just so hard. I come from the world of enterprise SaaS, where you can, spin up a prototype in a couple of months, and if you're lucky, hit some great ARR and get investment and have an exit. Here you actually need to often deliver real science, things that actually work and treat actual illnesses. And then there's just the incredible amount of upfront investment that's required in order to get, it seems like often a very binary outcome. And so I think that creates all sorts of systemic pressures to keep things really closed and competitive pressures and so forth. As I think about the tech analogy, and maybe going back to the story of AlphaFold and DeepMind, it seems like maybe the initial thought was, can we become like the Microsoft, where we can have this great technology and this platform and kind of sell licenses to a bunch of folks. Then they were like, well, maybe that's not going to be the case. Maybe we want to become more like Apple, where we vertically integrate, where we control the software and the hardware. In this case, it's like, well, we control the software, but also maybe develop the molecule and then develop the drug and become this, maybe the next Pfizer or so forth. The path that you're taking, there was a blog post, I think his name was Daniel Perman, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote a post where he described you as the sort of Red Hat, like Linux of the enterprise or of the space. And so for folks who are less familiar with them, there's, in my understanding, like Linux is a piece of software that came out that was incredibly helpful as enterprises wanted to adopt it. they then also needed like somebody to call and file a ticket to, and a sense of a roadmap and prioritized support and so forth. And so Red Hat provided that kind of best of both worlds, an open source model with some of like the enterprise, tender love and care, TLC. Is that the vision for Boltz, to be that kind of Red Hat that straddles kind of enterprise grade supports and services with kind of an open source model, or is it different?
Yeah, I think this is where the challenge of these comparisons break down, which is the challenge is that open source software and open source AI models are actually kind of very different. Software and AI models are very different, and the challenge is when you think about Linux, it wasn't really a Red Hat that developed Linux in the first place. I mean, there were definitely contributors, but it was really sort of like a huge community effort that built Linux. In the same way, it's hard to kind of see the same happening with models, because really models are things that you train at very discrete times. And so, you really need to have, a team of engineers working together, pushing and then making that huge, data and compute investment to get kind of the next generation of models. And so that's why, I think, there is, that's kind of where I think, not necessarily kind of the same, open source kind of, approach that has worked with something like Linux will work with AI models. And why you also see many of the frontier AI labs, yes, open source some of their models, but at the end of the day, when you think about kind of what they provide, is that they provide access to these models. And so I sometimes I think people mistakenly kind of think about open and close in this space in the same way that people think about open and close in the space of language models, which is sort of like whether you are open source or closed source. But as I was mentioning, I think the thing that we focus on is access. Some of our models are open source, some of our models are closed source, but every model is accessible on our platforms and soon also in other ways. And kind of, and if you compare it to for example Isomorphic, where it's not just that it's closed source, is really something that as a scientist, even if you want to pay, you can't access. You only get access to kind of the downstream drugs. And so taking it back to the kind of the examples of the big AI labs, because as I was saying, I think it's better to compare to open and closed models. Is really thinking about as if like a company like let's say taking kind of AI for code like Anthropic were to say what we don't want to actually give access to these coding models that we are developing to developers around the world. We just want to hire software engineers and get them to build every piece of software out there. And instead we're taking the approach of no, we want to give tools to every developer that is out there.
As we talk about business models and also about the nature of the science, there's a term that I've run across around computational drug discovery, which has been around pre-AlphaFold. There are a couple of companies, one I think not too far from here, at least one of their offices, Schrödinger, which has a platform to enable this. There's Recursion out, I think in Utah, that also is focused on these. Like what's different about the platform that you're building versus those platforms and tools that have been for sale for a while?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, the unfortunate thing is that platform is such an overloaded term in this space, where I come from a computer science background, where a platform is like a piece of software that you can ship. In the space of biotech, a platform is something a lot more unclear. Often it refers to just some technology in a much more vague sense of the term. And so like for example when thinking about like the platform that a company, a pharmaceutical company like therapeutic company like Recursion has, is not really a piece of software, but it's really a sort of like a combination of different technologies that they put together to build kind of therapeutic. So I would say I would separate those, and one more direct comparison is definitely kind of the one with Schrödinger, where I mean they have a few different products, but in general they have a suite of software products that they sell to basically every large pharmaceutical company. Now the difference is that basically largely Schrödinger is built around physics-based simulation and kind of modeling and visualization software, and kind of the piece of software that we are building in terms of our platform is really kind of built on top of kind of this new kind of foundation models. And so the kind of task that we're trying to give help on have some overlap, but really are kind of different from the one that Schrödinger has been trying to serve. And even when we think about talk for example with some of our users and some of our pharma partners, really the ways that the budgets that our tools help reduce is not the computational budget that they were spending previously, but is really kind of the experimental budget now, because you can design, let's say with Boltz or our recent protein design models, you can design a molecule computationally. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have to test experimentally. You do have to test, but the kind of test that you're going to do experimentally is much more limited. And so rather than doing this very large scale experimental and very costly experimental runs, you're going to run a large things on computationally and then a much smaller thing experimentally.